All right, everyone, get ready. We're about to take a deep dive into the world of negotiation, and specifically how the roles we play can totally change the game.
Oh, absolutely.
Our source material for this deep dive is audio from a fascinating lecture series that delves into all these dynamics.
Yeah.
And by the time we're done, you'll walk away with some seriously powerful tools to become a much more effective negotiator.
You will.
Whether it's at work, in your personal life, you name it, we'll be uncovering some seriously intriguing stories along the way, too.
Oh, yeah.
We'll be hearing about a radio station manager's unexpected motivations, a job interview that went hilariously wrong,
Uh-huh.
and even a flight engineer pulling off a real-life miracle over the Atlantic. Like, who doesn't love a good aviation story, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But before we jump into those thrilling tales, let's start with the basics. What are these roles we're talking about, and how do they actually influence our negotiations?
What often trips people up is that these roles we play are often very subtle, almost subconscious. We're just so used to being, say, a manager or a parent or a friend that we don't even realize how those roles are coloring our actions when we're trying to negotiate something.
It's like we're on autopilot, totally unaware of the scripts we're following.
Yeah.
So we're talking about more than just our official job titles here, right? It goes deeper than that.
Absolutely. There are the obvious roles we have, the ones we call conventional roles,
Yeah.
like being a spouse or an employee. But during a negotiation itself, think about those temporary roles that we step into.
Okay.
Like the listener or the problem solver or the advocate. It's almost like putting on different hats, right?
I love that analogy. So how does this actually play out in a real negotiation? Can you give us an example?
Take the story of the radio station manager from the lecture.
Okay.
On the surface, he just seemed like a greedy guy, right? Refusing every offer to buy his station.
Yeah, sounds like a tough negotiator.
But when you look deeper, it wasn't actually about the money at all.
Really? So
Yeah.
what was it about then?
He was actually terrified of how selling the station would impact all those roles he held so dear. You know, being a good husband, a provider, a successful entrepreneur.
Wow, so it was about his identity, who he saw himself as.
Exactly. It was like selling the station threatened his whole sense of self.
That's powerful. So instead of just throwing more money at him, what could those potential buyers have done differently?
Well, that's where understanding those underlying roles becomes so powerful. They could have, for example, explored how to structure the deal in a way that preserved his sense of accomplishment.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Maybe they could have given him an advisory role after the sale or really highlighted the legacy he was leaving behind.
Right, so instead of feeling like a failure, it could have felt like, a fulfilling next chapter for him.
Precisely. And that's a really big takeaway here. Taking the time to truly understand the other side's roles, it can actually help us craft solutions that work for everyone. Win-win situations.
And it's not just about them, right? It's about us too.
Absolutely. Before you walk into your next negotiation,
Yeah.
think about it. Jot down those roles that you think the other person is likely inhabiting and how what you bring to the table,
Huh?
impacts each of those roles. It's a game changer.
That's a really powerful shift in perspective.
Uh-huh.
I'm already feeling more prepared for my next negotiation. But it sounds like there's also this whole perception element at play, right?
Yeah.
How the other person sees their role can make or break things.
Oh, you are so right. Remember that example from the lecture, the one about Jane completely bombing her job interview?
Oh yeah, that one was rough. What happened again?
Well, Jane went into the interview thinking her old classmate Melissa would totally give her the inside track, just because they were friends.
Right, like a little favor among friends.
Exactly, but she completely misread the situation.
Oh no.
Melissa was in full impartial evaluator mode. She had to be professional.
Mm-hmm.
And Jane just kept trying to leverage their friendship.
Ouch. That sounds awkward.
It was so awkward and it cost her the job.
Wow. So what could she have done differently? Would simply acknowledging that formal setting have helped, you think?
It might have. Just something as simple as saying,
Yeah.
hey, I know this is a formal interview, but,
Right.
that could have established a shared understanding right from the start and maybe prevented all that awkwardness.
Right. It's like setting the ground rules before the game starts.
Exactly. Especially when you have multiple relationships with the person you're negotiating with.
Uh-huh.
Being really upfront about how you see the current dynamic, that can build trust and help prevent those miscommunications.
That makes total sense. This reminds me of that story about Lord Caradon, a British diplomat, and his Soviet counterpart during the Cold War.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
They were working on this really crucial UN resolution, but they were constantly clashing. just butting heads at every turn.
Really?
What happened?
Well, at some point, they decided to shift gears. Instead of sticking to those formal, almost antagonistic roles,
Mhm.
they moved to a more personal, informal setting.
And guess what? They connected over a shared love of poetry.
No way.
Seriously. And that totally unexpected connection built a level of trust that allowed them to actually see past their political differences.
Wow.
And they ended up reaching a breakthrough agreement.
That's a powerful story. It reminds us that sometimes recognizing that human element, the roles we play beyond our job titles or our national identities,
Right.
that can open up some really incredible possibilities.
So we're not just stuck with the roles that life throws at us. We actually have some control here.
Oh, you absolutely have control. We often have way more freedom than we realize to actually shape our roles and take initiative.
I love that.
Remember that amazing story about the B-17 bomber? The one that lost all 4 engines over the Atlantic?
Oh, yeah. Talk about a high-stakes negotiation, right? Negotiating with fate itself.
It doesn't get much higher stakes than that. Everyone on board thought they were doomed. I mean, how could they not?
So what happened? Did they make it?
Well, the co-pilot froze up completely. He was stuck in this victim role. But the flight engineer, he decided to rewrite his part in the story.
Wow.
He refused to accept defeat.
What a hero. What did he do?
He stepped way outside his job description, becoming a problem solver, an innovator, a hero, basically. And against all odds,
Yeah.
he actually figured out a way to restart one of the engines.
No way. So they made it back.
They did. They managed to limp back to base. It's a pretty dramatic example, but it shows us that even when it feels impossible, choosing to expand our roles, to take on a different hat, so to speak, can lead to extraordinary results.
So sometimes the most effective action comes from going beyond those confines of our defined roles.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
But how does this translate into, say, everyday work situations? Like, let's imagine an employee named Ryan who's dreading his upcoming performance review.
Okay. Yeah.
How can this whole roles concept help him get a better outcome, besides just showing up as grumpy employee, which I'm guessing isn't the best strategy? Well, the lecture actually gave Ryan a really solid framework.
Yep.
And I think a lot of it applies to all of us, regardless of our specific situation.
So it's universally applicable.
I think so. First, there's that role itself. Ryan was encouraged to really think about whether there was a more fulfilling conventional role he could be pursuing within the company.
I see.
And then to think about which temporary roles he actually wanted to embody during that review meeting.
So it's about being intentional, choosing those roles strategically rather than just letting them happen by default.
Yeah.
What were some of those temporary roles that he could try on? And more importantly, what are some options for our listeners who might be in a similar situation?
Well, the lecture highlighted a few key areas that I think are super relevant here.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, there's appreciation.
Appreciation. Wait, so he's supposed to go into his performance review and appreciate his boss.
Yes. Start the meeting on a really positive note, genuinely appreciating his boss, and even, modeling the type of behavior he'd like to see more of. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it can be so powerful.
So instead of going in all defensive, ready to argue, he should be thanking his boss. How does that work?
It's all about setting a collaborative tone from the very beginning.
I see.
It doesn't have to be this over-the-top praise. Just a sincere acknowledgement of something he genuinely values about his boss or about their work. It really shifts the energy. Instead of it being adversarial, it becomes, we're in this together.
Okay, I can see how that could totally change the whole vibe of the meeting. What else?
Then there's affiliation. Approaching the review not as a battle, but as a joint problem-solving session, really finding common ground and focusing on those shared goals. Instead of feeling like he's being judged,
Yeah.
Ryan can try to frame it as a collaborative discussion.
All right, so it's like, we're both on the same team here. Let's figure this out together. That's a much more empowering approach.
Yeah.
What were some of the other strategies?
Well, there was autonomy.
Yeah,
It was all about reframing that power dynamic, Instead of feeling like he's at his boss's mercy, Ryan was encouraged to view the feedback as hypotheses to be considered,
Interesting.
choosing his battles wisely,
Uh-huh.
and being proactive about sharing information.
So it's more like he's evaluating the feedback rather than just passively absorbing it.
Yeah.
That's a much more, proactive stance.
Okay.
Anything else?
Finally, there's status.
Status. Okay.
The lecture reminded Ryan to really recognize that everyone brings different areas of expertise and status to the table, It's not about one person having all the power.
Right.
Instead, it's about acknowledging and leveraging those differences for mutual benefit.
I love that. It's a reminder that even in situations where there's a clear hierarchy, like a performance review, both people have something valuable to offer. But what about when things get heated? Even if we're trying to be all strategic and cool-headed, emotions can run high in these situations, right? And sometimes it feels like they could completely derail the whole negotiation.
You're so right. Emotions are a huge part of the equation.
Yeah.
And they can definitely throw a wrench in things if we're not careful.
For sure.
The lecturer actually used a great example, a sponsorship deal that went totally wrong. It started with two people who were, initially quite friendly,
Right.
but they ended up having this massive blow up, just shouting at each other. Emotions took over and, completely clouded their judgment. It ate pretty messy.
Oh, wow. So if we know that these intense emotions are inevitable, what can we do to prevent them from, hijacking the negotiation? It feels like we need some kind of emergency plan in place, right?
You are so right. That's exactly what the lecture suggests, having a plan before things get out of hand.
Okay, I like that.
Having those self-soothing techniques ready to go and having some strategies for soothing the other person too.
Okay.
If they're the one who's about to lose it. It's like that old saying, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
So what are some of those self-soothing techniques? I'm always up for finding my inner Zen master. But seriously, what are some practical things we can do when we feel those emotions rising?
There are actually a bunch of different approaches. The lecture mentioned things like counting, deep breathing,
Oh, yeah, the classic.
taking a break, visualization, even changing the subject for a moment. Anything that helps you regain your composure prevents those emotions from completely taking over.
Right, it's like hitting the pause button before things escalate.
Exactly. And the key is to choose a technique that really works for you and to practice it beforehand. So when you're in the heat of the moment, you can access it easily.
So it's like having a go-to move, a way to de-escalate when things get intense. That makes sense. But what about the other side of the coin? What if the other person is the one who's about to go nuclear? How can we help them calm down without making things worse?
Well, it's all about de-escalation.
Oh.
Start by really acknowledging their emotions. Saying something like, I can see you're really frustrated can go a long way.
Right, because sometimes it's just about feeling heard and understood.
Exactly. And sometimes just calling a break.
Yeah.
Suggesting a change of scenery, maybe even a different person to take over the conversation.
Okay.
That can all help diffuse that tension. It's like hitting the reset button, right?
Right, because sometimes just stepping away from the situation for a few minutes can totally change the whole dynamic. But, just calming down those emotions, that doesn't actually solve the underlying problem, right? We need to actually get to the root of those feelings if we want to find a real solution.
You're absolutely right. The lecture emphasized that those strong emotions, they're like messengers. They're actually telling us that something is wrong, that a core concern isn't being met. It's like our internal alarm system is going off.
I like that analogy. So in the case of that sponsorship deal gone wrong, what might be driving those strong emotions on both sides? It sounds like some serious detective work is needed here.
It is. For the person whose expectations weren't met, it could be a sense of unfairness.
Okay.
Like they feel their company's efforts weren't really appreciated or that they were taken advantage of.
Right.
Or it could be a threat to their status. That feeling that the other company doesn't really take them seriously.
And for the other person, the one who, maybe didn't deliver on the deal, what might be going on for them?
They're probably feeling a lot of pressure, to protect their own company's interests.
Right.
And their own reputation, probably feeling cornered, like they don't have enough options.
That's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And it's important to remember that everyone comes to the table with their own, baggage. Yeah. Their own set of fears and motivations.
So once we've done that detective work and we've figured out, what's really driving those strong emotions, how do we actually use that information to move forward? It feels like we're getting into some pretty deep psychological territory here.
We are. And that's where the lecturer's advice about expressing emotions strategically comes in. Remember those 4 purposes.
The 4 purposes of expressing emotions. Refresh my memory.
Okay, so there's venting, communicating impact, influencing behavior, and preserving relationships.
Right. And each one has its own nuances and, potential pitfalls.
Yeah.
We talked about venting earlier, how it can be more helpful to do that with a neutral third party than with the person who's actually triggered us.
Right.
But what about those other purposes? Let's start with communicating impact. How can we do that effectively without sounding like we're just whining or playing the victim.
Well, it's all about being clear and calm, explaining how someone's actions have affected us without blaming or attacking them. The lecturer used that great example of the medical student who felt constantly humiliated by her supervisors, like harsh questioning style.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. She was about to quit, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was, but instead of saying, "You're being such a jerk," you know,
Right.
she just calmly explained how his behavior made her feel, what impact it was having on her work,
Anyway,
and what she was considering doing as a result.
so she gave him a heads up.
Exactly. And guess what? He had no idea how his actions were being perceived.
Wow, so sometimes people just don't realize the impact they're having.
Yeah,
That's a good reminder to, try to give people the benefit of the doubt.
absolutely. It was a really powerful example of how providing that insight rather than assigning blame can be incredibly effective.
Okay, what about using emotions to actually influence behavior? That one feels a little trickier. I mean, can we really do that without being manipulative?
It's definitely a tightrope walk,
Huh.
you know? The lecturer actually made a really important distinction between genuinely revealing strong emotion and deceptively feigning it.
So it's okay to express our true feelings as long as our intention isn't to, manipulate the other person.
Yeah.
But how do we know where that line is? It all seems a bit blurry.
It is blurry, and honestly, it's a question we all have to grapple with. But I think the key question is,
Yeah.
am I being authentic?
Okay.
Am I expressing my true feelings in a way that respects the other person and the situation?
Right.
Or am I just trying to use my emotions as a weapon to get what I want?
That's a good question to ask ourselves. It's about checking our intentions, making sure we're coming from a place of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what about that last purpose? Expressing emotion to actually preserve relationships. That one seems especially important, in long-term collaborations.
It is. It is. And it really ties into everything we've been talking about so far. Understanding roles, managing emotions, and communicating effectively. The lecturer actually highlighted two key tactics here.
All right, let's hear them.
Okay, the first one is explaining our intentions.
Okay.
And the second one is offering sincere apologies when appropriate.
So instead of just assuming the worst about someone's actions or, getting all defensive, we should take a moment to clarify, WHY, we did what we did.
Absolutely.
That sounds like a great way to prevent misunderstandings and build trust.
It is. Transparency can really go a long way in maintaining those positive relationships, even when things get heated.
Yeah.
And when we've genuinely messed up, a really heartfelt apology can be incredibly powerful. It shows we care about that relationship and we're willing to take responsibility for our actions.
Okay, so going back to that sponsorship deal gone wrong, it sounds like both parties need a solid game plan for navigating those tricky emotional waters. They need to understand each other's roles, have those self-soothing techniques ready to go, and really be prepared to communicate, clearly and honestly about their feelings and intentions. That's a lot to juggle.
It is. It is. But the good news is that these are all skills we can develop with practice.
Okay, that's encouraging.
The more we pay attention to these dynamics,
Yeah.
the more adept we become at navigating them. It's like, learning a new language. The more we practice, the more fluent we become.
I love that analogy. So it's not about being perfect. It's about being aware and being willing to learn.
Exactly. Exactly. And don't be afraid to, experiment and make mistakes along the way. That's how we grow.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I've already learned so much about how roles and emotions can impact negotiation. How about you?
Me too. I think the key takeaway here is that we're not powerless in these situations. By really understanding these dynamics, we can take control. We can steer ourselves towards more fulfilling outcomes. So true. So to wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question to ponder. Think about a current or upcoming negotiation in your own life, whether it's at work or with a family member or even with yourself. How might you apply this concept of temporary roles to actually achieve a better result? What hat could you put on that might shift the dynamic in your favor?
Oh, that's a great question. And, as always, we encourage you to keep exploring the world of negotiation and share your own aha moments with us. We're all in this together, learning and growing along the way.
We'll be back soon to continue this conversation and explore even more strategies for mastering the art of negotiation. Stay tuned.
Can't wait.
Welcome back. I don't know about you, but after that last segment, I'm already feeling a lot more equipped to handle those tricky negotiations. Before the break, we were talking about how even with the best intentions, those strong emotions can really hijack the whole process. Oh, for sure. It's true, even for, the most seasoned negotiators. They can get caught up in the heat of the moment, too. That's why having those, self-soothing techniques
Right.
and a plan for de-escalating, it's so crucial.
Right. It's like having an emotional fire extinguisher handy, just in case things start to get out of control. Speaking of which, we were discussing that sponsorship deal gone wrong.
Mhm.
What are some concrete steps that, say, Bill, the negotiator trying to salvage that deal, could take to actually manage those strong emotions? It sounds like he's got a lot on his plate.
He does. He does. First and foremost, he really needs to be mindful of his own emotional state.
Okay.
He's got a lot riding on this meeting.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get swept up in the frustration, especially when he's dealing with someone who's already upset.
So self-awareness is key. What would that actually look like in practice?
It could be something as simple as, noticing those physical signs of stress.
Okay.
Maybe his heart's racing, palms are sweating, his jaw's clenching.
Right.
That's his cue to actually engage those self-soothing techniques.
Like taking a few deep breaths, right?
Yeah.
Just to kind of center himself.
Exactly. Deep, slow breaths that can really help to calm his nervous system and prevent him from reacting too impulsively. He could even excuse himself for a moment just to regain his composure, step out, get some fresh air, whatever works.
Okay, so he's got his own emotions in check. But what about Sandra, the one who's upset about the deal? How can Bill actually approach that conversation without making things worse?
It feels like there's a lot of potential for things to, really explode.
Oh, you're right. It's definitely a delicate situation, but,
Mhm.
you know, instead of getting defensive or trying to minimize her feelings,
Yeah.
he could actually start by simply acknowledging them.
Okay.
He could say something like, I understand you're frustrated. It sounds like you put a lot of effort into this partnership, and it's really disappointing when things don't go as planned.
That's so much better than just saying, come on, it's not that big a deal.
Right. Just validating her feelings, that can make a huge difference.
Exactly. It shows that he respects her perspective, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with it.
Right.
And that can create a space for, you know, a much more productive conversation.
And if things start to escalate, he could always suggest taking a break, right?
Mhm.
Just to kind of diffuse the tension.
Absolutely. A timeout can be a real lifesaver in these situations. Gives everyone a chance to, cool down, regroup, and come back to the table with a fresh perspective. Sometimes you just need a little space to breathe.
Right, because sometimes just stepping away from the situation for a few minutes can totally change the whole dynamic.
Mm.
But, calming down those emotions doesn't actually solve the problem, right? It feels like we need to dig a little deeper,
You're getting it.
to really understand what's going on beneath the surface.
Remember those messengers we talked about earlier? Those strong emotions? They're often symptoms of something deeper. Some core concern that isn't being met. It's like, our internal alarm system is going off. Pay attention. Something's not right here.
So in Bill and Sandra's case, what might those deeper concerns actually be? What's driving those strong emotions? It's like we need to put on our detective hats.
We do. For Sandra, it could be a sense of unfairness, right? Like she
Okay.
feels like her company's efforts weren't appreciated
Uh-huh.
or that they were taken advantage of in some way.
Right, right.
It could also be a threat to her status, like
Ah.
her company isn't being taken seriously by Burger Brothers.
Yeah, that would be frustrating. And for Bill,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's probably feeling the heat from his own company, right?
Oh, definitely. He's probably feeling the pressure to, protect his company's interests,
Uh-huh.
to salvage the deal, to maintain his own reputation.
Right.
It's a lot to handle.
It is.
Hmm.
So once we've kind of identified those underlying concerns,
Mm-hmm.
what do we actually do with that information? How do we use it to move the negotiation forward?
That's where those 4 purposes for expressing emotions come in. Remember those.
Yeah, venting, communicating impact, influencing behavior, and preserving relationships.
You got it.
We talked about venting earlier, how it's usually best to do that with a neutral third party.
Right. Someone who can just listen and offer support.
But what about those other purposes? Let's start with communicating impact. How can we express how someone's actions are affecting us without sounding like we're just complaining or blaming them?
It's about finding that sweet spot, between being assertive and being respectful.
Right.
So instead of saying, you really screwed this up,
Yeah.
you could say something like, when this happened, it really impacted our team's ability to meet our goals. And, it caused a lot of stress.
So it's about focusing on those concrete consequences of their actions rather than making it a personal attack.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
Okay, what about using emotions to influence behavior? That one still feels a bit ethically murky to me. Like, can we really do that without being manipulative?
It's definitely the one that requires the most caution.
Okay.
Remember that distinction we talked about before the break? There's a big difference between expressing genuine emotion
Right.
and, deceptively feigning it.
So if we're truly feeling something strongly, it's okay to express it,
Yeah.
but we need to be really mindful of our intentions.
Exactly.
Are there any guidelines for navigating this tricky territory?
I think the key question to ask ourselves is, am I being authentic? Are we truly feeling this emotion?
Yeah.
Or are we trying to manufacture it to get what we want?
Right. It's a gut check.
It is.
And if it feels manipulative, it probably is.
Exactly.
Right, because in the long run, that kind of tactic can really backfire.
For sure.
It can damage trust.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that even in a negotiation,
Yeah,
we're still dealing with human beings.
right.
Building and maintaining those relationships is crucial.
Especially if you're going to be working with these people in the future.
Exactly, exactly.
That brings us to that last purpose, expressing emotion to preserve relationships. It feels like this one is particularly important in those situations where you have an ongoing collaboration, like with Bill and Sandra and their sponsorship deal.
Oh, absolutely. And the strategies here are all about, building and maintaining trust. Remember those two key tactics from the lecture?
Explaining our intentions and offering sincere apologies when appropriate.
You got it.
So even if you're feeling, frustrated or angry,
Yeah.
it's important to take a moment to clarify why we did what we did
Yeah.
and to own up to our mistakes if we made them.
Exactly. Transparency and accountability can go a long way in preventing those misunderstandings and repairing those damaged relationships.
This is all so insightful. It's like we're learning this whole new language for understanding
Right.
and navigating human interaction.
I like that. I like that. And just like learning any new language, it takes practice. The more we pay attention to these dynamics, the more skilled we become at, using them effectively.
So we shouldn't get discouraged if we don't get it perfect right away.
Oh, absolutely not. It's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
The key is to be open to learning, to experimenting,
Uh-huh.
and to refining our approach as we go.
Speaking of refining our approach, I'm curious, how can we handle those situations where someone is intentionally trying to use those strong emotions to manipulate us? And that is one thing to manage our own emotions, but what about when someone is coming at us with like an arsenal of emotional fireworks? How do we protect ourselves without, shutting down completely?
It's a great question, and it's something we all have to deal with at some point. Not everyone plays fair in negotiation, right?
Right.
And there are definitely people out there who will try to use their emotions as weapons to get what they want.
So how do we spot those tactics? Are there any like red flags we should be looking out for?
There are a few things to watch out for. If someone's emotional display just seems really excessive
Okay.
or out of proportion to the situation,
Right.
it could be a sign that they're trying to manipulate you.
Right.
Also, if they only get emotional when they're not getting their way, that's another red flag.
So it's like those kids who throw tantrums to get what they want.
Yeah,
Only in this case, it's grown adults doing it in a boardroom.
exactly. And unfortunately, some people never really grow out of those tactics.
Wow. So what's the best way to actually respond when we suspect someone's trying to, play us with their emotions?
The key is to stay calm
Okay.
and focused on your own goals.
Yeah.
Don't let their emotional fireworks, distract you from what you're trying to achieve.
So it's like that old saying, don't wrestle with a pig.
Yeah.
You both get dirty and the pig likes it.
Exactly. Don't get sucked into their drama. Just stay focused on the issue at hand.
Right.
And don't let those emotional outbursts derail the conversation. Easier said than done sometimes, though, right?
Yeah, it can be tough to stay cool when someone is, you know, yelling or being aggressive. It feels like we need Jedi-level emotional control to pull that off.
It's definitely a skill that takes practice. But one helpful strategy is to remember that their strong emotions are likely a sign that one of their core concerns isn't being met. You know?
So instead of reacting defensively,
Mm.
we should try to figure out what's driving their emotional response.
Exactly. It's like trying to see the world through their eyes, even if it's difficult.
Right, it's about empathy.
Yeah, yeah. Once you understand what's actually fueling those strong emotions, then you can try to address the root cause rather than just reacting to, the surface behavior.
And sometimes that means taking a break, right?
Mhm.
Just stepping away from the situation for a few minutes to give everyone a chance to, cool down, hit the reset button.
Absolutely. The lecturer actually compared it to having an emergency plan for a hospital. You don't wait until someone's having a heart attack to figure out what to do, right?
Yeah.
You have those procedures in place so you can respond effectively in the moment.
That's a great analogy. So in a negotiation, we need to have our own emotional emergency plan,
Hmm.
with those self-soothing techniques, strategies for soothing others,
Yeah, have it all ready to go.
just in case.
Exactly. And just like any emergency plan, it's best to rehearse it ahead of time so, you're not caught off guard
Right.
when those intense emotions inevitably arise.
This is all incredibly helpful. It's like
Mhm.
we're gaining this whole new level of awareness and control over something that can often feel, really unpredictable and overwhelming.
I'm so glad to hear that. You know, Ultimately, that's the goal of understanding these dynamics,
Yeah.
to really equip ourselves with the tools and insights to navigate even the most challenging situations.
And to do it with, grace and skill.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
remember, we're all in this together, learning and growing along the way.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive.
We'll be back soon for the final part, where we'll wrap things up and leave you with some really powerful strategies for mastering the art of negotiation. Stay tuned. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into roles and emotions in negotiation. It's been a fascinating journey exploring this often overlooked but incredibly important aspect of, well, pretty much every interaction we have.
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground, from those hidden roles we all play to those tricky emotional minefields that can totally derail even the best laid plans. But I think the biggest takeaway is that we're not powerless in these situations. By understanding these dynamics at play, we can actually take control and steer ourselves towards those more fulfilling outcomes.
Right. It's like we've been given this secret decoder ring for understanding human behavior, those patterns, those subtle cues that could really make all the difference. And before the break, we were talking about those situations where someone is intentionally trying to manipulate us with their emotions. It's like, how do we stay calm, assertive, but also protect ourselves from being taken advantage of?
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head. It's not about becoming some kind of, emotionless robot. It's more about understanding those dynamics and then responding in a way that, well, serves our interests, but also maintains a sense of integrity.
So we don't want to, stoop to their level and start playing those emotional manipulation games.
Exactly. We want to rise above that and stay true to our own values. The lecture really emphasized that, emotions themselves aren't inherently good or bad. They're simply information. It's what we do with that information that matters.
So how do we process that information effectively when someone is, kind of wielding their emotions like a weapon against us?
Well, sometimes the most strategic response is to just, acknowledge that emotion without really engaging with it directly. Remember that old saying, don't wrestle with a pig?
Oh yeah, you both get dirty, but the pig likes it.
Exactly. So if someone's trying to bait us into this, big emotional showdown, we can just say something like, I hear that you're frustrated, but we don't get sucked into their drama.
Right, we're not feeding the fire. So we're acknowledging their feelings, but we're not letting them dictate the course of the negotiation. This brings us back to those temporary roles, the ones we talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah, the different hats we can wear.
Exactly. And the lecturer emphasized that we have a lot more freedom than we realize to choose which roles we play in a negotiation.
We do. And, those choices can have a really profound impact on the outcome.
So if we habitually play, let's say, the role of the accommodator,
Hmm.
always giving in just to avoid conflict,
Yeah.
we might end up with some less favorable outcomes.
Absolutely. It's about, becoming more conscious of those default roles that we tend to fall into
Mhm.
and asking ourselves, are these really serving me well? Do I need a new hat?
Right. Like, do we need to switch up our wardrobe a little bit? Find some new negotiation outfits, so to speak.
Exactly. And experiment with different roles to see what really works best in those different situations. It's like having a wardrobe of different negotiation personas, each one suited for, a particular context.
Yeah. So we can be, the problem solver in one situation,
Yeah.
and then maybe the advocate in another. It's about being adaptable.
Absolutely. And, just like with any skill, it takes practice. Don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, learn from those experiences.
This has been such an enlightening deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new toolkit for approaching those negotiations, both in my work life and my personal life.
Me too. And I think the key takeaway here is that, we're not at the mercy of those roles and emotions.
Right.
By really understanding these dynamics, we can take control and steer ourselves towards those more fulfilling outcomes.
And we don't have to do it alone, right? We're all in this together, learning and growing from each other's experiences. So as we wrap up this deep dive into roles and emotions in negotiation, I'd love to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question to ponder. Think about a current or upcoming negotiation in your own life. How might you apply this concept of temporary roles to achieve a better result? What hat could you put on that might just shift the dynamic in your favor?
That's a great question to reflect on. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating world of negotiation. Share your own aha moments with us. We're all learning and growing together on this journey. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the intriguing world of human behavior.